So thank you all for joining our session today. So today's session is on data-driven insights into evictions and encampments, bridging gaps to prevent homelessness. So we do have two different presentations today. So the first part of the presentation, we will present some key findings from some of our recently released CMHC research on evictions in Canada. So I'm joined today by Kathleen Wharton and Michelle Verbeek to present some of those findings. This will then be followed by Professor David Walksmith from McGill University, who will focus on some research on encampments and alternative housing preferences. We'll then have a discussion moderated by Oweo Deshime, who's right here in the front. And we'll just have a discussion among ourselves based on the research and some of the overlaps with our research. And then we'll open it up to discussion. So if you have a question that you'd like the panel to answer, then we're more than happy to. So I am visiting Montreal from Toronto, and Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. So as a visitor to Montreal, I would like to give thanks to the First Nations around Montreal who have frequented and occupied the territory for millennia. I have deep gratitude for this land and respect and appreciation for its many generations of caretakers. So before we present some of our findings, I did want to just kind of situate where we're coming from at the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation. So as I said, I'm joined here today by Kathleen and Michelle to present some of our insights from our recent CMHC research on evictions. And their links to homelessness and health. So before we share those sorry, this is the wrong. Give me 1 second. Okay, thank you for that. In the research division, all of our research is housed into so CMHC is a large corporation. And within that corporation, we do have different teams. And one of the teams that we do have at CMHC is research division. And even within that research division, it is quite large as well. And we have very different thematic areas of research based on our expertise. And so one of the thematic areas is our housing needs and what we call hubs. So we have different hubs for the different research areas. And we work primarily in the housing needs hub. And we work to answer these three main questions. So the overall purpose of the Housing Needs Hub is research to conduct research really to understand the barriers and challenges people are facing. I'm going to keep doing that all the entire presentation. Sorry about that. And some of the strategies that have been implemented to address those challenges. Sure.
Let's do with that, but let's just close this one for now.
Cool.
And for the switch, I'll come back.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And what are some of the possible solutions we can help address those challenges? So looking really at more systemic solutions. So the evictions research is one of those projects where we're able to demonstrate the consequences of evictions, especially as they relate to homelessness and also the negative health impacts. So to better understand the consequences of evictions on people, we use the Canadian Housing Survey. So in today's presentation, we'll first kind of describe what the Canadian Housing Survey is and how we used it for this research in particular. We will also highlight some of its limitations. And then Kathleen will unpack the links between homelessness and evictions. And Michelle will showcase the disproportionate impact of evictions on different populations, as well as explore how evictions can lead to poorer health outcomes. So generally, this was considered a research insight series. And so we produced 3 different publications. And the publications kind of like spoke to each other. So the first one was really on the links between evictions and homelessness. The second one was about looking at population groups that are at higher risk of experiencing an eviction, and then also looking at the links between health inequities and evictions. So all three of these reports were based on key findings from a literature review for each one of those topics, and then survey data from the CHS, so the Canadian Housing Survey, from two different cycles, from cycle 2, which was 2021, and cycle 3, which was 2022, and kind of bled into 2023 during the collection period. So what exactly is the CHS? Just very quickly, show of hands or yeses, how many of you have used the Canadian Housing Survey before or have read a report on the Canadian Housing Survey? Okay, awesome, so a few of you. So for those who don't know too much about it, the Canadian Housing Survey is conducted every 2 years, and it started in 2018, and it's in partnership with Statistics Canada. So it collects information on Canadian households, on their homes, communities, housing needs, and housing experiences, and I can show you a few of the topics that they cover in terms of housing experiences. And it oversamples those living in social and affordable housing, so it gives detailed and precise statistics on households in social and affordable housing, as well as those who are renting and also homeowners. So although the CHS is a great source of information on housing needs among those living in Canada, there are several limitations we need to consider, especially for the research we conducted on evictions, and especially when we tried to link evictions with homelessness. So the two major limitations for our research was that the sample group. So the CHS collects information on sample households in Canada. The sample does not include people who are currently experiencing homelessness during the time in which the data was collected. The sample of households also doesn't include people living in institutions or collective dwellings. So this would also include seniors' residents and student residences as well. The second limitation, specifically for linking homelessness and evictions, is that respondents were asked to report the year and the month they last experienced an eviction in the CHS, but they were only asked to document the year that they last experienced homelessness. So it's not entirely possible to, with a high degree of certainty, to assess if experiences of homelessness occurred right after an eviction. So, as I said before, the CHS covers a wide range of topics based on households' housing needs and their experiences with housing. And so here are some of the topics on the left. It's also the only really Canadian national survey that covers people's experiences of evictions, and that means whether they happen formally, so if it's gone through a tribunal or a court process, or if it happens informally. So it does not go through that process. The CHS would still capture that. And we capture that using the modules of, or the topics of previous accommodation. So the previous accommodation, the 2018, 2021, and 2022 indicate the cycle years. So we use 2021 and 2022 previous accommodations. And then, again, additional topics. We also have a specific forced moves module. So the forced moves, evictions, and the reason for the eviction. So again, we use 2021 and 2022. And to be able to link that to impacts of evictions and consequences of evictions, and also who's disproportionately impacted by evictions, we connected it to the topics highlighted in green, so general health and mental health. There was a disability screening question that was only occurred in the 2021 cycle. So we used that for the 2021 analysis. And then we also used the homelessness module and the immigration and citizenship status to just see some of the patterns of who is experiencing evictions. So I'll now pass it on to Kathleen, and she'll share some of the findings on the links between homelessness and evictions.
Thanks, Mary Kay. So when we looked at the potential links we could identify between evictions and homelessness through the CHS, we came at it through a couple of different analyses. So the first thing we looked at was the prevalence of evictions. So with the data from this cycle, what we found was when we looked at the prevalence of evictions in the general population in Canada, we found that about 7% of people indicated that at some point in their life they had experienced an eviction. When we narrowed that to just those who also indicated that they had an experience of homelessness, that prevalence was 28%, so it was about 4 times higher than the general population. So this indicates that there's probably something here that links it in the data. Then for our second couple of analyses, we wanted to see, okay, how can we best determine if it's possible that these two things are happening around the same time? And we had to look at doing our analysis this way because of the limitations that Mary Kay mentioned, because we can't identify in chronological order if an eviction is happening before an experience of homelessness amongst people who said that they experienced both. Instead, what we're doing is we're looking at, in a given year, how many people experienced both an eviction and homelessness. So we looked at 2021 because that was the most recent full year of sort of data that we had from the CHS because it was conducted between mid-2022 and mid-2023. So we went to 2021 to see how many people were saying they had been evicted that year, how many people were saying that they'd experienced homelessness as well in that year. And what we found was that 19.1% of households indicated that they'd experienced an eviction in 2021 and also experienced hidden homelessness that same year. There was a very small percentage who experienced absolute homelessness, but that value didn't meet Statistics Canada's threshold for what we can confidently say is a finding, and that's likely because of the limitations of who's sampled for the CHS and the fact that it's probably not a great data source to be looking at people who are experiencing absolute homelessness. So in finding 2, we were looking at everybody who experienced an eviction and trying to figure out how many people experienced homelessness. Then in finding 3, we took a slightly different angle and we looked at, out of everybody who experienced homelessness, either hidden homelessness or absolute homelessness in 2021, how many indicated that they'd been evicted. And that number was 9.8%. So a key takeaway for me in looking at some of these analyses is that I think in particular, that 19.1% really stands out because it suggests that a lot of people who are experiencing an eviction are likely having difficulty finding another unit to live in after that eviction. Again, we can't tell for sure that these two are happening, one after the other, but based on some qualitative research that we have and some of the findings in the literature, it's likely that this is the connection. So I will leave it there and we'll pass it over to Michelle to go through some of the other pieces of work.
Let me switch the slides. Amazing. Thank you, Kathleen. So the second research insight in our 3-part eviction series is called Evictions in Canada, People Experiencing Vulnerabilities. And in this report, we explore 2 major questions. The first being whether specific populations experience greater risk of evictions in Canada, and the second being what key knowledge and data gaps should be addressed to deepen our understanding of these experiences for these vulnerable populations who have experienced an eviction. So behind me here are 3 of our key findings. The first, this is all again based off of CHS data. So the first key finding is that Black renters are disproportionately impacted by evictions in Canada, despite making up only 14.7% of the racialized population. They experience 24.4% of evictions amongst racialized groups. And The data specifically highlighted that this issue was prevalent in 2 provinces in particular, where Black renters who have experienced an eviction, and this is that 44% of those live in Ontario and 31.8% live in Quebec. The second key finding is that Ontario stood out again as a hotspot for evictions amongst immigrant populations, where 46% of immigrants who live in Ontario have previously experienced an eviction. And our third key finding, last but not least, one of the key findings from Cycle 2 of the CHS was that there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people who have experienced an eviction in the past, despite making up only 4.3% of renters. 5.9% of all renters who've experienced an eviction identify as Indigenous. So the graph that we're looking at here is looking at forced moves prior to and after 2016. You can see from the data that the majority of respondents who've experienced a forced move have experienced one after 2016. And this is true for all of the population groups except for white respondents and Filipino respondents. So moving on, this is our third and final research insight, which is called Evictions in Canada, Inequalities in Health among groups at higher risk of evictions. So this report is seeking to address 3 major questions. The first is, how do different types of health conditions contribute to eviction? The second is, what are the health outcomes of evictions? And the third, what supports do rental tenants need before, during, and after an eviction? So the 3 key findings from this report are, first and foremost, that people who've experienced an eviction have the lowest self-reported physical and mental health. The second is that the chance of being evicted more than doubles for people who self-reported a higher degree of disability. And our final finding was that households that reported living with mental health challenges were more likely to be late on rent and have conflicts with landlords. And this suggests that housing supports should include mental health supports. I'm just going to look at some of the data now. So this is, again, using Cycle 2 of the CHS, but this figure demonstrates that the chance of being evicted more than doubles for people self-reporting for a higher degree of disability. I'm going to pass it back along to Kathleen, I believe.
So we just wanted to highlight some of the implications of the work that we did in this Research Insight series. So a couple of themes that really stand out for us, which we've heard a number of times at the conference, are the importance of wraparound supports alongside housing. So definitely we know that this research identifies that when it comes to certain populations, when it comes to those who are experiencing health challenges or other mental health or potentially relational challenges, having those supports is really key to be able to ensure stability of housing. And then also the importance of eviction prevention programs that are really trying to meet people who are in a situation where they might be facing an eviction to try and help to prevent that before it happens. We heard this morning the minister say that investing in prevention is a really good way of addressing some of these problems. So we can see that through some of what we've determined and discovered in these findings. And we also know that when the supports exist, having them in existence and then being resourced is one thing, and then also ensuring that people are aware of them. So whatever can be done to help landlords to understand that there might be some of these challenges being faced by their tenants. And for example, if they have an older tenant who misses rent 1 month, to understand that there could be an empathetic way of reaching out and seeing, was that something that had to do with memory, and what supports they might need to help ensure that they're able to meet those criteria of their rental agreements. There's also a number of takeaways here in terms of the need for more data. So we started with the Canadian Housing Survey because it's a data source that we have, and we know it's not perfect for looking at some of these questions, but it is a starting point. And we know that there is a need for some more data development, data linkage, data sharing, where possible, to really understand the scale of eviction and what is happening. Also, data sets that allow us to look more specifically at what's happening to certain groups in certain geographies. We are looking at these questions from a national lens, but we know that evictions can be very localized or more influenced by geography. So the more data we have, the more we'd be able to look into that. As well, it would be really helpful to have longitudinal sources of data so that we could really better understand what's happening in individuals' lives or their circumstances leading up to an experience of eviction, and then what happens after the eviction in terms of their ability to find stable housing or some of the health or well-being challenges that they might be experiencing as a result of the stress that we know happens when people are going through an eviction. Then in terms of some of the directions that we've identified for further research, in this Research Insight series, we looked at things sort of separately. So we looked at homelessness and evictions, and then we looked at health and evictions, and then we looked at vulnerable populations and evictions. So it would be really helpful to look at some of those questions all together to understand, for individuals who are experiencing homelessness and an eviction, what's going on in terms of their experiences of health challenges, which population groups are affected. So trying to dig into this a little bit more deeply. We also see a need for more research that really could look at how evictions might trigger or worsen cycles of housing instability and homelessness. So in the analysis here, we looked at to what extent are evictions happening around the same time as an experience of homelessness, but we really want to understand more about what's happening in the short term that might link evictions and homelessness, and then what might be happening over the long term if there is a cycle of housing instability where ultimately individuals are finding themselves sort of in more and more difficult housing situations and then ultimately finding themselves experiencing homelessness. There's also a gap in the research on the experiences in the context of evictions and how it affects children. So that's something that we've identified as a need for further research. And also, there's always a need for additional research on the uneven impacts of eviction on racialized populations and Indigenous populations as well. So I believe that wraps up our presentation, and we'll pass it over to Dr. David Waxman. Okay, I'm going to let the tech people.
Oh, okay. Great. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm very happy to be here with you today. My name is David Walksmith. I'm a professor here at McGill University, and I'm going to be presenting on some of the results from a study that my team and I did with CMHC. I guess we published it last year. We're going to look at kind of one case study from a broader project, and the case study is about kind of what we know about homeless encampments on the island of Montreal, and kind of contextualized within the question of transitions within the housing continuum more broadly. So just a couple kind of words of preamble. At McGill, I direct the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, where we investigate pressing urban governance challenges. And one of the kind of major focuses for us has been the growing crisis around housing affordability in Canada, and the way that market and non-market housing kind of interact within that crisis. This is the report itself, kind of obligatory QR code if you want to go check it out. What we're gonna talk about today is kind of one slice of what is. I mean, the report itself is pretty gigantic, and we cover a lot of ground looking at housing transitions. Before I get into the case study itself, though, I want to kind of ground the work in the broader question of the housing continuum, because this was kind of the genesis of the project. I think probably most people are familiar with the model here. This is CMHC's, kind of cheerful graphic, which I think does a good job of showing the continuum model. The idea is that the housing continuum is a model to represent the range of housing options available to people, but also kind of the types of movements which occur occur between different housing types. Now, the model itself has its roots in mental health deinstitutionalization. And one of the kind of frequently noted facts about the housing continuum model, which is often a kind of a point of departure for criticism, is that it implicitly, at least, and maybe explicitly, embeds a specific kind of notion of progress in terms of individual housing journeys, which is to say that you're supposed to go from left to right on this continuum. And, I think that on the whole, like we can kind of, in a lot of these cases, that seems like a reasonable movement. Like if folks who are in homelessness, we do kind of hope that they're going to move to other points on the continuum. But at other points on the continuum, maybe we would want to question that. For example, is a move from community housing to market housing appropriate move for all people? Hard to say, right? It's also true, and this isn't really a point of criticism, but it's a point of kind of, departure for kind of understanding how well the housing continuum represents the actual trajectories of Canadians, the housing trajectories of Canadians, is that some groups experience easier transitions in this kind of normative left to right direction than others do. In a lot of cases, the actual individual trajectories don't look like that kind of, straightforward progress. And we want to kind of understand what's going on in those cases. So the project itself was designed to kind of dig into the housing continuum by looking specifically at cases of kind of movements between housing types which don't feel very well represented by the kind of left to right progress here. These were the specific set of research questions that we tackled in the overall report. I'm not going to go into all this right now, but the kind of the big picture here is kind of focused on this issue of populations whose movements kind of defy the expectation of kind of left to right progress along the continuum, and what we can learn both about those populations, but also about the kind of broader terrain of housing opportunities in Canadian regions. So we did 3 specific case studies for this project, again, kind of looking at housing transitions which were kind of felt difficult to reconcile with the housing continuum model. We looked at the explosion of hotels as temporary refugee shelters over the last couple of years. That was kind of focused on Southern Ontario in particular. We looked at homeless encampments, focused on the island of Montreal, and then we looked at cooperative housing in Metro Vancouver. We did 50 structured interviews with service providers and with people with lived experience. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus specifically on the question of homeless encampments on the island of Montreal. And then at the end, I'll kind of broaden out again to talk a little bit about the bigger picture of housing transitions. So first of all, just a little bit of context here. I think this will be familiar ground to a lot of folks, but it's important for us to be on the same page. There has been a very widely noted visible rise in homeless encampments, particularly kind of in parks and public spaces across Canada, right? This is not obviously there's not a Montreal only phenomenon. This has been noted across the country. It's been a topic of increasing policy concern, as well as kind of alarm bells sounding from advocates. It's 2 of the kind of most often identified factors, kind of specifically trying to understand why encampments have so visibly exploded in recent years. First of all, the COVID pandemic, which put a lot of the kind of the housing, the emergency shelters, other kind of housing options into, made those more difficult to access. But then also just the broader housing affordability crisis. And one of the kind of the evolutions of policy relating to encampments, which we've seen here in Montreal, and I think has been common in other parts of the country as well, was that kind of after an initial period of maybe kind of like official, like kind of ignoring of the question of encampments, there's been a kind of a turn towards more aggressive policing, and particularly some of the, there were a series of kind of large visible encampments in Montreal, which have been broken up, and kind of put the topic kind of right, kind of in, into newspapers, into the public consciousness. But I think there's a kind of also been a growing, kind of understanding that it hasn't meant that encampments go away. They've just kind of scattered, become more hidden. So in this context, encampments are really, they're a very tricky problem to understand from a kind of a research and a data perspective, right? And so what we did is we did the interviews, we visited a lot of the encampments to try to kind of understand, first of all, just the kind of, the patterns of who's living in encampments, where they're coming from, where they're going to. And so we'll talk about, first of all, some of the kind of demographics, but then get really into and really focus on the question of transitions in and out of encampments. In other words, what do we know about the folks who are living in encampments, what their housing situation was before they arrived in the encampments, and then even, kind of harder to understand, but we did our best, is also what happens to folks after they leave. Because this is an area where we, for a lot of the reasons that we're, actually already heard, it's just really hard to get, official administrative statistics that are going to answer these kinds of questions well. So first of all, kind of looking at some of the demographic patterns, I think this is going to overlap, pretty strongly with a lot of what we already know about the kind of folks who experience homelessness. But just to kind of, confirm that these are the facts here in the case of encampment residents as well, that residents of encampments on the island of Montreal are overwhelmingly either men or heterosexual couples. So there are very, very few women who are in encampment situations, and it was kind of universally identified that this is for safety reasons, right? But single men and heterosexual couples are kind of the overwhelming predominant inhabitants. There's a very high overrepresentation of people who inhale or inject drugs. And also a high overrepresentation of people with mental health challenges. One of the specific categories of individuals with mental health challenges that was flagged in the context of encampments is people with hoarding disorder. People, for who, and actually I was part of a panel yesterday that was talking about the links between hoarding disorder, evictions, and homelessness. But the kinds of folks who experience homelessness as a result of being unable to hold on to stable housing because of hoarding disorder, they're also the same kind of folks who are going to really prioritize having a place where they can kind of have their belongings. And so homeless encampments, actually, this is one of the kind of key demographics. And then lastly, people with pets, right? And so the kind of common thread between a bunch of these categories, certainly couples, people who are injecting or inhaling drugs, people with a bunch of different mental health challenges, and people with pets, is also that these are folks who don't have access to the shelter system, right? Because generally speaking, couples aren't allowed. Generally speaking, pets aren't allowed, and certainly there are going to be restrictions on drug use and the rest of that, and keeping personal possessions. So there's a lot of kind of conversation, which again is kind of I think covers somewhat familiar ground in terms of what we know about the kind of connections between people living on the street and people interacting with the shelter system, which is, that there's a lot of fear of the shelter system. There's, in some cases, a kind of, folks who kind of just, don't want to be living there, even if maybe they had the option. But in a lot of cases, people who don't have that option are the population we're looking at in the encampments. We're now getting into kind of the harder to measure terrain, which is looking at the way that people kind of flow in and out of encampments. In a minute I'm going to kind of show this diagrammatically in terms of the housing continuum model, but just to kind of get the facts on the table, what we learned. It is very clear that most people who are transitioning into encampments are transitioning from other forms of homelessness. Now, this is not everybody. There's we'll talk about the other kind of categories of folks as well. But we had reported kind of a high level of churn both between individual encampments, like kind of from one to the other. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a minute. But also from other forms of homelessness. So people who, for example, had kind of like seasonal journeys where they are in the shelter system in the winter, and maybe kind of in years gone by they'd be kind of living solo on the streets. Those kind of folks are now more often living in encampments when the weather supports that. But among the folks who are transitioning into encampments from outside, from some other kind of housing situation that couldn't be characterized as homelessness, we had specifically flagged two circumstances as kind of standing out from respondents. The first was evictions. So we heard about and we talked to quite a number of people who for whom they're living in the encampment that they were living in was their first experience with being not stably housed, and it followed an eviction. Again, I think we can draw pretty direct linkages there with the affordable housing crisis, and and it's something that, in some of the previous work that my team has done with CMHC is certainly a pattern that we've seen. I think it kind of is consistent with what was just being presented here in terms of the fact that I think we know that eviction is a kind of independent risk factor causing homelessness. It's not just kind of the end of a kind of, process of increasingly unstable housing. An eviction is creates homelessness where there might not have otherwise been, and certainly we saw those folks. What we also saw was that a particular risk factor for ending up in an encampment was being evicted from public housing. And the story here I think is pretty straightforward. It's that the population who is living in public housing, because we know like how inaccessible that is in terms of just the size of the wait list, like the number, like the kind of huge gap between a need for subsidized housing and availability of subsidized housing. These are folks who, if they are forced to leave, either because they, non-payment of rent, for kind of, breaking other conditions of their occupation, they're really unlikely to be able to find other stable housing, particularly find stable housing which isn't subsidized, right? It's just not going to happen. So there's a kind of a major vector kind of, pushing people into homelessness. Lastly, what we found were certain kind of geographical patterns. So as an example of this, there are now homeless encampments throughout the entire island of Montreal, right? So Montreal is a pretty dense city, but when you get to the periphery of the island, we're taught it's definitely quite a bit more suburban. One kind of one pattern that we saw was folks who would spend a certain amount of time kind of downtown, and then would actually kind of decamp for the suburbs. And we specifically heard that in this kind of language, in order to kind of get a bit of rest. That the kind of like downtown encampment life was hectic. There's stuff happening. There's kind of social opportunities. I want to talk a little bit about the community aspects in a second. But then also, kind of moving to one of the peripheral encampments, kind of offers an opportunity to kind of get away from some of that hustle and bustle, which is kind of an interesting kind of parallel with I think broader questions of geographical residential mobility, right, in terms of the connection between central cities and suburbs. In terms of transitions out of encampments, what happens when people leave? In most cases, what happens is people who leave an encampment go to another encampment, right? And the number one cause of people leaving encampments that we found was the encampments being broken up by police, right? So the situation of what we saw were very few cases of folks being able to access housing kind of further right on the housing continuum when they left encampments. Instead, what generally happens is encampment reaches a certain size, the police come and break it up, the folks who living there kind of disperse to new sites. A minority, but we did see these cases. We're able to access some form of transitional housing or rent stabilized housing, rent subsidized housing. But more or less nobody we were seeing was getting into market rate housing. And the fact that we've got such a small amount of subsidized and transitional housing available, kind of helps explain what's going on here, right? That there's a kind of a potential pathway into market housing if you can afford it, but of course these are, that's going to be an unlikely scenario. It's worth kind of noting here that we were really kind of collecting this data in conditions of really like a lot of difficulty, just frankly, kind of collecting the data. Even among like the service organizations that are working to support folks in encampments, they not only are generally not they don't have the kind of detailed information and records about the folks that they're working with, kind of understandably, but also quite often expressed a lot of discomfort with the notion that they should even want that type of data because of a fear of ultimately if there's more surveillance and tracking of folks in these situations, what is that data going to be used for was a kind of a pretty frequent concern raised. But it means that on the whole, what we're left with is a situation where it's possible to kind of understand the patterns and the kind of broad contours of movement in and out of encampments, but very, very difficult to kind of nail that down with more precision. So this is the kind of overall model that emerges, right? So we've got the housing continuum up on the top. We understand what we'd like to see as this kind of movement left to right. What we actually see overwhelmingly is people cycling between different forms of homelessness, with, again, the kind of major movement being from encampment to encampment as those encampments are broken up, and also as kind of people have individual changes in their life circumstances. And then, a kind of a flow of folks into encampments, both from the private rental market following an eviction and and particularly from kind of, community subsidized housing. And then very, very small flows of people being able to access transitional, some kind of supportive housing, kind of coming out of encampments. And in those, I don't think I mentioned this, but in the cases that we heard about where people were able to access those kinds of services, it was specifically because of support organizations that were there to kind of help, like, in the context when it's understood that the police are going to come break up the encampment, like folks like the Old Brewery Mission, who are there on site to try to kind of match people with housing options, in the context of those, the encampment dismantlements. One kind of a point that is not strictly related to the question of the transitions in and out of encampments, but it was a really interesting point of discussion that we had with our respondents. So I want to flag it. I would say ambivalence about the question of what the kind of broader policy should look like towards encampments with respect to dismantling them, formalizing them, trying to support them. The way that we characterize this is, really the idea that formally recognizing encampments would be a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, there was really so this is among service providers, right? A really kind of like a lot of outrage with the notion that we should accept homeless encampments as a kind of, as an acceptable form of housing. That fundamentally kind of, regularizing them would be an admission of defeat and a lowering of housing standards, right? But at the flip side, the understanding that given that the broader housing situation is such that, encampments are now kind of inevitable, fact of life for a lot of folks, there are kind of pretty obvious deficits in terms of the kind of services that are available to support folks who are in the encampments, and also opportunities that don't exist with other forms of homelessness, because you have, potentially fixed sites where you could have a kind of, where like support services could be more readily available. So like a lot of kind of like ambivalence about, what would be appropriate in that respect. What participants pointed to in terms of some of the kind of key recommendations were stuff that I think nobody's going to find surprising, right? But it's just because we know it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep saying it, right? So that first of all, that there's just not even close to adequate funding for transitional housing, right? That if we want people to be able to transition out of these more challenging housing situations, there needs to be the actual programming to, make those kind of pathways real. And that, particularly we're dealing with folks who are struggling with mental health and addiction issues, and kind of specific supports that are going to be helpful. And that lastly, probably despite the fact that nobody really wants to see encampments kind of regularized as a kind of feature of the housing system, it's clear that the kind of geographical fixity of the sites means that there's an opportunity for kind of providing additional services on site, and that could help participants. So that's the case study. To kind of broaden it out now and just say a couple words about, what we took from this case study to think more broadly about the question of transitions within the housing continuum. And kind of we're going to be drawing on the other cases we did as well a little bit here. One of the things that we found kind of broadly across this research is that the continuum just didn't do a great job of representing the kinds of both of kind of specific like housing types we were seeing, but also the actual pathways that people take, on their kind of individual housing journeys. Housing paths are not linear. We know this. Frequently, people are kind of jumping, kind of leapfrogging over multiple parts of the continuum. One kind of, one idea we heard from several folks was, we could think about instead of kind of like a human-centered circle, right? Like individuals with a kind of range of options around them, and the way that they move between them is going to be kind of distinctive for individuals. But what we ended up coming up with in terms of kind of, trying to think about ways that we can kind of understand housing transitions more adequately, was to make a distinction, which is, I think is simple but is powerful, which is rather than thinking of a kind of a single one-way, kind of progress or failure in terms of housing journeys, understand that there are multiple goals in kind of, in people's housing trajectories, and that particularly stability and autonomy are two complementary but actually kind of distinct dimensions of the kinds of transitions that people can make through the housing system. So here we've got this kind of one-way axis, which, in some cases, again, this kind of, is a kind of a transition to more potentially kind of stable forms of housing, but not necessarily in all cases. Certainly, private market rental is going to be a lot less stable, in the face of evictions, rent hikes, than some like subsidized rental, for example, which is kind of, further to the left on the continuum. So instead, what we came up with is the following. And think about kind of two dimensions of housing transitions. On the one hand, a kind of a journey from instability to stability. And on another hand, a kind of distinction between dependency and autonomy. And the idea here is that, on the whole, there's a kind of, a concept of progress going from the bottom left to the upper right. But in lots of individual cases, individual housing needs don't mean that progress is going from the bottom left to the top right, As just a kind of, one kind of obvious example of this, institutional care is going to be like the best place for a lot of folks in terms of their own needs, their capacities. That represents a situation that's quite stable, but doesn't give them a lot of autonomy. And in certain cases, that's going to be a kind of an appropriate place to be. Similarly, we can see that kind of, between sleeping on the street and encampments, like we're dealing with kind of, relatively comparable, housing situations in terms of instability, right? But that one of the features of encampments that respondents discussed quite a bit in relation to kind of solo living on the street is the prospects for kind of working together and kind of forging community, giving all the members of the encampment kind of collectively more autonomy in terms of kind of control over how they live their lives, some form of kind of, kind of decision-making power, basically, which again isn't kind of, I think isn't, easily represented in the kind of continuum model. So these were the types of movements that we saw in our work. And so we're talking about encampments over here. We kind of see these like kind of transitions in and out of what are different forms of homelessness, in and out of the shelter kind of these kind of basically negative transitions away from stable housing. In some of the other case studies we looked at, we saw other transitions as well. And then lastly, here's a way we can. Now this is the traditional housing continuum, kind of remapped onto this, onto this grid. So we kind of like the steps that we go from homelessness through the shelter system, transitional housing, is a kind of basically a pathway up, to the right here. But in certain respects, involves potentially kind of negative movements. And in particular cases, when we're looking at the difference between market housing and non-market housing, there are aspects of that which are kind of positive transition, aspects of that which maybe in individual cases are not going to be. So we found this to be a kind of, like a helpful kind of tool for decoding the landscape of housing transitions. And this is the last slide. We'll just kind of, again, kind of preach to the choir here, say a few things we already know, but to really kind of hammer home a couple points about, fundamentally kind of what's the problem with the kind of linear model of the housing continuum. And basically the problem is that the middle part of the housing continuum isn't real. That we've got a continuum which has market housing on one side and homelessness on the other, and then a range of options in the middle, which are meant to support people's kind of journeys towards more, stable and fulfilling housing options. But they're fake, and I don't mean they're fake in the sense of I'm sure lots of people in the room kind of work in the supportive housing sector, work in transitional housing services, but there's not even remotely enough funding, capacity, supply of these forms of housing to support people's actual needs, and also to justify a kind of, frankly, like a model of the housing system which kind of pretends that these are, relatively kind of equal, contributors to the housing options available to Canadians. So, we got this idea of the missing middle, like we need to build more dense housing. We think kind of like in the housing continuum, like, subsidized housing is the missing middle on the continuum, right? Like we see it on the map, on the diagram, but it's not real. The other 2 points here, first of all, and then I'll be done, is that one of the things we saw is that the lack of affordable housing is not just a problem for, the specific question of like individual households who are trying to access affordable housing. It actually makes all aspects of housing policy worse. Because in the case of homeless encampments, it's clear that an enormous source of the difficulty with with encampments is the fact that realistically people just can't transition out of the encampments because the housing options don't exist to support them. In the case we did looking at co-ops, one of the kind of really interesting things we found is a transition from co-ops as a kind of place for like intentional living, where people like enjoy the fact that they can buy in to a co-op with their neighbors and kind of have a kind of collective say in how they live, to a situation where fundamentally it's an option to pay below market rent. And that's too bad, because we should have lots of options for folks who need to pay below market rent, and we should also have lots of options for folks who want to have kind of collective intentional living communities. And because we don't have enough affordable housing, co-ops are facing a lot of pressure as kind of one of the small number of places that people can go to get their affordable housing. So, I think we'll have a discussion. We can kind of touch on some more of these points, but for now, I'll just say thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mary Kay. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, folks. So yeah, very quickly, my name is Owayo. I would love to be a researcher, but I'm not. So I'm from CMHC as well, from the outreach team. So in a nutshell, making connection from like folks from the sector to everything that we have internally, programs, research, and other stuff. So come say hi. Je parle français aussi, c'est ma première langue, et on est à Montréal. Donc, n'hésitez pas à poser des questions en français. C'est des chercheurs, c'est très technique, mais je vais faciliter l'accessibilité linguistique. So what we're gonna do, we wanted to dive in more on the series, and so I'm gonna be asking a couple of questions to our researchers, so that there's like an opportunity to dive in a little bit. I'm just going to be mindful of time as well. Thank you all so much from all the folks in the sector, your work and commitment. I personally applaud it, and I know that you have a lot of support internally from CMHC, from my leadership, and many of my colleagues who have attended and who are following us. Evictions, encampments, and the link to homelessness. I think I'm very happy that this conversation is being had, because we need to look at this in a system and full circle way, and really see what are the causes that are specifically linked to evictions. I wanted to start off with a first question to my three colleagues, and David as well, and you can chip in. And so I'm wondering if you can, deep dive more on why is it important to learn about transitions between housing types and homelessness, and what are some limitations of learning about transitions solely based on quantitative research methods. If you can share a little bit more about that.
Doesn't matter. We're deciding who goes first. I guess, are you cool if I? Yeah, okay, I'll start. I'm sure all of us here have a lot to say on this. I think David touched upon like the importance of understanding transitions, and specifically that transitions don't happen in that very linear way that is in the current housing model. And to understand those various transitions, it's very, very difficult to capture it just through data. People are complex, their experiences are complex, their housing journey is not static, it's not linear, and so with quantitative data, it becomes very difficult to capture that and capture their lived realities. And so at least for us in the Housing Needs Hub, we like to pair quantitative research with qualitative research. Especially as we noted in the CHS, there are a lot of limitations. Also, some of the data, how it's presented, sometimes people can take that data and infer it or interpret it in a completely different way. And so that becomes important. And also, David also noted, there are a lot of communities who don't feel super comfortable sharing or like taking a survey or documenting their experiences, especially depending on who the survey is coming from too, right? And so being aware of that and understanding that you really need to have relationship building and fostering that rapport to be able to understand those experiences. That happens through qualitative research methods. And so data only gives us a fragment of the picture.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think when it comes to looking at the connection between evictions and homelessness, clearly from the analysis we did with the CHS, we have that big gap of not being able to position the two in time and having to assume based on other research how they might be connected. But also the quantitative data doesn't help us distinguish why some people are experiencing, in this case, hidden homelessness after an eviction and why others aren't. And that's where it's really helpful to have some of the qualitative research. So David Foxsmith and his team conducted a qualitative study looking at lived experiences of evictions a few years ago. So if you don't mind me just sharing a quick finding from that I recall, I know there were a number of people in those interviews who said that they experienced an eviction and just narrowly avoided finding themselves in a situation of homelessness because they had support from family and friends. That looked differently. Maybe it looked like being able to support first month's rent, but it really helps us understand what might be happening and what might really be going on behind those numbers.
Yeah, so I'll touch a little bit on the data side of that question. So apart from some of the most obvious issues, which is primarily around data quality and availability, one of the other issues we have when we're just specifically looking at quantitative data is it's not able to capture the agency of the individuals or the households, and we're just losing so much nuance and experiences from just looking at data specifically. We have an understanding that evictions occur differently and can be very specific to different households, whether that be across Canada or amongst different population groups or at different stages of life. But we're really not able to capture the nuance and the experience. We can tell when an eviction happened and when it happened, but not really how it impacted that individual or that household, either leading up to the eviction or immediately after, and finding those causal links. So there's just so much of the nuance of an eviction that we just aren't able to find, that we rely really heavily on qualitative data to help us inform and give voices to those experiences.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. One other thing I would say that just kind of speaks to the specific question of why housing transitions are a kind of important moment for us to be looking at is that these are kind of the moments of peak opportunity and risk, and to kind of focus specifically on evictions here. I'm really a broken record on the idea that evictions are a cause of precarity, not a consequence of precarity. Sometimes everything's always both, but that in general, a big part of the kind of new landscape of landlord factor kind of no fault evictions is stable households who are suddenly kind of thrown into instability because of an eviction. And when we did our project on this, the two things that were interesting here that I think speak to kind of the moment of transition as this kind of important point to understand. First of all, is just how many people who were basically middle class paying the rent would not have described themselves ahead of time as having financial problems, still ended up homeless after their eviction. And usually it was the kind of hidden homelessness. They were sleeping in their car, they were on a friend's couch, or that kind of stuff. But that was a third of respondents in our study who were folks who had incomes above the national average. And a third of them were not able to access stable housing after they were evicted. And many of them, had things like they had their relationships break up, someone lost custody of their children, they lost their jobs, that kind of thing. But also within our sample, a bunch of people ended up buying houses. In other words, the eviction was a moment for them where, again, we're dealing with kind of, basically relatively well-off middle-class households where, okay, we've been evicted. We need to kind of figure out what our new housing situation is. Now's the time to kind of call in the money from mom and dad for the down payment. And so that the kind of, even kind of in a broad sense, evictions are kind of I think is overwhelmingly clear are a negative force in people's individual housing trajectories. In fact, they are kind of moments of uncertainty, and that uncertainty can get, there are kind of many different outcomes which can emerge out of the other side of that. So I think it's like, generally speaking, most people don't move in a given year. They live their housing, and their housing remains relatively stable. Their rent doesn't change that much. So the moments when that isn't true are kind of like the basic kind of like the key action points that we need to try to understand. But just as by the virtue of like the way that we gather data are just usually the hardest things to find out about, because we can ask, okay, what's your housing situation? But it's a lot harder to know about those transition moments.
Thank you, David. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for positioning this conversation about the transition specifically at this conference. I think even myself, like reading your work is just, somebody had to talk about it, and it's super important. And I wanted to come back on a little bit the limitation of quantitative methods, and then turn to a practical side, maybe more from a researcher side. And I want to know, access to data is important for evidence-based decision making. And so specifically, what are, you talked a little bit about it, but what are the challenges you encountered in attempting to collect data? I don't know if anybody, you choose.
Choose someone.
I choose. I thought you were. Go ahead, Murky.
I'll start, and then, okay. So I will admit I'm not really a data person, so Michelle really helped support us on that end. But I do work with Statistics Canada around the Canadian Housing Survey, and sometimes you really do have to think about like how someone will read this question. Will it resonate? How will it be interpreted? Is it accessible? Those types of questions. And then also, we don't want to overburden communities with continually asking the same questions over and over again, especially specific populations that continue to be surveyed. And so it's very important to be mindful of that. And then specifically for Indigenous First Nations communities, we do also want to ensure that we're practicing the principles of OCAP. So ensuring that Indigenous communities have access to and own their data is really important. And so that can sometimes take a larger strategic, a longer strategy to implement for research specifically. And I think, and again, really understanding that sometimes people will not feel safe to answer a question, or people may feel a sense of shame answering questions as well. And being cognizant of that, and having that as a caveat to some of the limitations and the percentages we share with folks is very important. Yeah.
Also, when developing survey questions, we sometimes have an opportunity to provide some input, but of course there's a limitation to the number of questions that can go in a survey. And also, it's important to keep in mind that the questions need to be applicable for a broad range of purposes. So the more specific we make them for maybe one research project, the less applicable they might be in general. So that's something else to really keep in mind. And we're working with survey data largely through the CHS, but in some of our other work on evictions, we've also been looking into how administrative data is used, particularly in the United States, where they're able to have some more access to administrative data. And one of the things that's been found in terms of challenges with some of that data that they've run into when trying to use it for research is that it's not created for the purpose of research. So it's created for the purpose of the administration. And so sometimes when looking at some of those data sets in the States, the researchers have found that there's gaps or there's inaccuracies or there's missing data. And so it can be a little bit difficult to pull it all together and do the types of research that they're aiming for with those data sets.
I'll speak again about the data. So like for these like 3 reports, I specifically work with the microdata from the CHS, and I've spent some time looking at it and working with it. And like one of the issues is like when you're developing analysis of a subpopulation of subpopulation of subpopulation, is that it just leads to issues with data suppression and low observation counts, and that we're not like able to reasonably vet any of these numbers or report on them to the public, which is really unfortunate, but ultimately is the best option. But this specifically impacts like certain parts of the analysis where we're really interested in certain groups that just like aren't getting the attention, or we're not able to showcase like what their experiences of evictions are. So specifically some vulnerable populations in certain geographies across Canada we're really interested in, but we're not able to report on them in specific cities or communities. We maybe have to bring their data and combine it at a provincial level or a CMA level at times. And then also like rural communities we're really interested in, but because of like low observation counts, we're just like not able to report on these instances of evictions. So it really is like a shame, but there is a lot of interest, and we are aware of this and trying to still find ways. If we can't specifically incorporate their numbers in, like maybe there's like different ways we can manipulate the data to maybe be in a CMA or like still include it somewhat. So it's a really big challenge, but it is like top of mind for us in our group.
The one thing I'll just say is that sometimes, like as a housing researcher, I just like think about what might be like to be in a field where like the data that we need to answer the questions we want to answer is like actually available, instead of the situation in housing research, which is where, as far as I can tell, pretty much like all of the most important things we just don't have any data on, or we now are starting to. So homelessness, it's like, it's just a gigantic data gap. Evictions, until very recently, huge data gap, and we're never going to know historically. Property ownership, we know nothing about that. Until like a year or two ago, CMHC didn't gather data about asking rents and like only about average rents. And like asking rents are like the thing you need to know about if you're trying to understand housing affordability, right? Like it doesn't really matter. Like it's like what happens if you need to go find an apartment, So they're just so many topics where, you have to end up doing the kind of like, well, I guess we could kind of roughly think if we take that, like instead of actually just gathering the data you want and using the data you want. And the kind of, there's like a stats term for this, which I think is like really like hard to deal with in the case of homelessness research in particular, which is like sampling on the dependent variable. Like if you're interested in something that is like, you're interested in homelessness, but the way that the data is collected is very likely that, for example, like homeless folks are going to be underrepresented in the data you're collected, then you can't use that data to understand homelessness, because like the data is like kind of broken specifically by the phenomenon of homelessness. And that is like really just a kind of unsolvable problem. And it's really too bad, because it means we just ultimately, it means we need to do like qualitative research, we need to do other things which work well, but don't have the same kind of, like clear kind of, like legitimacy and like comprehensiveness, is something that say comes out of the census.
Yeah, I'm not a researcher again, or a data collector, or data specialist, but I've been on table conversation with Statistics Canada and CMHC, and understanding like, sometimes issues of even privacy and further vulnerabilities if you break down data to specific areas where you can identify folks, and you cannot just do that for their safety. And so what I'm understanding is there are transition types in the housing continuum that lead to homelessness that you looked into, and there are data challenges that we face. But yet again, I want us to consider all of this, and I want to ask you, why is this work so important in understanding real-world impacts of evictions, and what deeper research is needed? And so maybe I'll start on the other side this time, and I would want to know, David, can you expand a little bit more on the impacts of being evicted? And I do understand that your research brought into light that there's no one path of transition, but like if we can zoom out and you have highlights of like the impacts of being evicted, either from private or from an encampment, and why is it important to understand these impacts for additional research and data?
Yeah, so I think like as simply as possible, I think the issue is like this, that if it were the case that eviction is generally speaking, the kind of like the symptom of a broader process of like socioeconomic instability, and I think we can kind of picture what that model looks like, right? Like you got a household, they are paying the rent, somebody loses their job, they're falling behind on the rent, other things kind of are going wrong in their life, and eventually they stop paying the rent, and then they get evicted. If that's the case, then like the policy response you'd want would look a certain way. It might, for example, like you'd be looking at like income supports. If that isn't what most evictions look like, if instead what most evictions look like are households are just living their life, and the landlord decides at a certain point, hey, look, I could get more rent if I get some new tenants, and so they evict tenants, and if that's what evictions look like instead, like you probably just want like different policy. Like, for example, you just make it really hard to evict tenants, right? Like, which maybe you should do anyways, because like evictions are always just really harmful. But that like it's particularly going to be the case if evictions are kind of like no fault, kind of landlord factors, we call them, that we're going to want to have probably like a policy like regime at the provincial tenancy boards, which is just really skeptical about evictions occurring. And now here's the thing: as far as we understand, actually a majority of evictions now in Canada are no fault evictions. That's what the CHS tells us. We don't have historical data on this, so we don't know if it's changed, but I think a lot of people think it has. I think it's the most reasonable guess. And that so knowing specifically what role evictions play in the kind of broader like housing transitions of individuals, I think has like really profound implications for like for advocacy, for kind of like for public policy, right? And so again, it's like it's hard to actually answer these questions, but this is why I think it's like this is why I think I certainly like spend a lot of time trying to kind of bang on the drum of like kind of rethinking, reconceptualizing evictions as not the kind of outcome of instability, but the cause of instability, because I think it actually leads to totally different like things we should be doing. So yeah, I mean that's the short answer.
It's like a systems view, longitudinal view, and understanding to answer that. Yeah. Do you want Michelle to touch upon the question?
Yeah, I agree with everything David said. Obviously, the only thing I'll also mention is for evictions, I feel like we're really only scratching the surface. We really don't have the data to show a complete picture of what's going on with evictions. And it's just so important for us to keep working on this and keep gathering information. Evictions, how we interpret, we're just using the term eviction, but how it actually occurs is so different to every individual, based on how they interpret it and how the actual event occurs, and the impact of it. So we just need to keep working on this and get a more complete picture of what's going on, and also we're only from the CHS, we're only looking at the tenant experience, and there's so much data missing from the landlord side of things of what led that landlord to evict a tenant. So there's just so much more additional research and data that needs to occur to get a more complete picture of the events.
Another consideration there too is that we don't have long-term data. We're not able to really see what's happening to people over time. And so we can't capture instances where individuals might be getting evicted multiple times. So they face an eviction and then they move into a unit where they have to pay so much for their rent that they know the time is limited before they are not able to pay rent anymore. Or they might move and find another unit that's affordable, but then that building, maybe it gets bought, and they find that this happens again and again. So in the CHS, we don't have a question about repeat evictions, and we're not able to know what's happening to people who might be facing this multiple times in their lives. And we do know from some of the qualitative research that individuals who have an experience of homelessness are more at risk, they're more vulnerable to being evicted again, sometimes because they're in housing situations where they're not on the lease, and sort of whatever happens to the leaseholders happens to them. And then also they might be in situations where they're not aware of their rights, and if they get a notice or a landlord says you have to leave, they will leave and not know that there's a process. So there's a lot that we still need to understand in terms of how some of these cycles are happening and what people might be facing over time. The CHS, we just asked about the last experience of eviction, and there could be so much more in that picture.
Cool. I'll just quickly add, because I'm also curious to hear questions from the audience, that like a lot of the evictions literature has pointed to the impacts mainly through qualitative research. And so we know that evictions can break up communities, can break up families. We know that it impacts children having to move neighborhoods, which means moving schools, which means creating more instability at that level. We know that it can impact your job, it can impact careers, change your commute times, lots of different things. It can cause more financial impacts on you if you have to save again for first and last month's rent. All of these things, we know these impacts from qualitative research. I think the quantitative research helps us start to present the data to show like this is a concern, we need to address this. But I really think it's the qualitative side and understanding those impacts, because they have real impacts on people and their communities and their families. And I think that's necessary to also push for building maybe more specific tenant protections around different populations that are experiencing these evictions. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary Kay. When you're speaking, I don't know, I'm thinking teamwork, we have Michelle, who's like our data person, and then Caitlin and Mary Kay are really like knowledgeable on housing needs. And then David, thank you so much for like your people-focused insights. And then I send emails, I do logistics. And thank you for frontline workers and attendees. And it's the systems view, and so it should be a systems answer. And I'm very happy to have moderated this little conversation about really understanding the complexity of transitions and evictions as well. Looking forward to this next step of the conversation, which is all about you folks. I think there's a microphone somewhere. There you go. Thank you so much for that. Nous pouvons aussi poser nos questions en français. Je ne suis pas l'experte dans la conversation, mais je travaille à la SCHL et je pourrais faciliter la traduction ou que ce soit. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your experience or your questions specifically to this portion of this heartbreaking problem that is homelessness, so transitions and evictions. And if I could get your name if you're comfortable with, and where you're coming from, and which part of the sector, if we can say your. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Shannon, and I'm from Nova Scotia, and I do mobile outreach. So one of the things that we're noticing a lot with people coming to us is they don't necessarily know the tenancy thing, the board and their rights and all of that kind of stuff. But another thing we're seeing also is fixed-term leases, and not necessarily an eviction, but not a lease renewal. So is there a way of kind of accommodating this here so we're not necessarily, I don't know, I'm finding the fixed term leases are very problematic, because if they get into a year and the landlord wants to increase the rent, well, this is an easy way, because I just don't want to put renew that lease and get someone else in there. So we're noticing that a lot in our rural area, Nova Scotia, of where we're at. So is this becoming more problematic everywhere else, I guess is more my question.
I really am going to leave this to who's comfortable more, because I guess from like the whole list of your focuses, research, like please feel free to answer.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, end of year or end of term lease, that would fall under the umbrella term of like a forced move rather than eviction. So like in our research, we do look at forced moves because there's like a few other things that qualify for that as well. I jotted that down. I'm gonna double check if that's in the CHS, because that is like a really interesting point that like would be like good to further explore. Do you guys know if it's,
I think we just, for our forced moves, we do have the options of like, why were you last forced to move? And some of it includes like rent increases. And so it's something, it's a good question. We haven't looked into it to see a national view. It's important to know that that's happening in Nova Scotia and rural communities. But for me to give you a specific answer right now, I wouldn't be able to, but it's something I've also jotted down. Yeah, no, but it's really important. And I think like, I know, David, I might put you on the spot, but it's important to look at the different legislation and then like the risk of eviction or forced moves in those areas. And I think there's some promising future work, maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, two things about this. One is that, I mean, also the point you make about kind of, you know, the kind of tenant, like knowledge of tenant rights piece is super vital here, right? And it's, I mean, when I'm speaking to kind of national audiences, one of the things I like doing is kind of plugging the system we have here in Quebec, where we've got a really robust set of housing committees who work kind of, you know, who are basically able to, who are supply this kind of savvy. And in our work on eviction, we found outcomes in Quebec were better. Because, you know, specifically because it's pretty clear, people just had a better understanding of what their rights were. And so, you know, I think that like the kind of, you know, it's different in different provinces, but, you know, it is often the case that it's like, you know, you know, in the situation where that, you know, like you may not understand that if the landlord says, I don't want to renew your lease, that you just have the right to remain in the unit, right? And so you just say, okay, well, I'll leave, right? Even though in fact you are perfectly, you know, once you've signed the lease, that goes on. And so, you know, so kind of that the knowledge piece I think is important there. It's, you know, as Mary Kay previewed, one of the things we've been doing is trying to look systematically at the provincial level, what the actual tenant protections look like across Canada. And I think we've got some pretty cool, you know, kind of results here just to kind of understand what that landscape is. And also I think, and if I can share that, what we're finding is that it is clear that, you know, we see fewer evictions, as an example, in places where there are stronger controls on that, which is what we would hope, but, you know, it doesn't mean that that's how it works out in practice. So, but yeah, anyway, there's kind of more to come on that for sure.
Back here, I guess, Ben Appleby worked for an organization in St. John, New Brunswick. And we're an organization that runs programs on this, like across the spectrum of emergency shelters, drop-in centers, but also apartments and being a landlord. And then I came from a background of 10 years working in a Housing First program for an organization that was also a landlord that had 1,000 units. And so there's that perspective of both landlord and tenant. And one of the biggest issues we've seen is the shift from, I wouldn't say it was ever balanced, but you know, when you're going through an eviction process, far more towards the tenant side of things, that has actually resulted in more homelessness because landlords who would typically have provided units have now pulled out of that because they know even with cause, they'll never be able to evict a tenant, which then results in extensive damage to the building and also impacting safety concerns for the other tenants in the building. So we've had a lot of landlords that have walked away from providing subsidized apartments or at least participating in a rent supplement agreement. So I would certainly echo and advocate for more extensive research into the whole eviction side of things, but from both perspectives, because we need a healthy balance between those two things. Because the bigger picture is thinking of all the people in the building or in the community, where sometimes you do need to evict, but then you're 4 months doing that, which actually results in more homelessness than just being able to evict that tenant, even though you're an organization that would support the tenant that got evicted into finding some other place to go that's safe and stable. So I just would echo that we need more research into those areas.
That's I guess, you see my colleagues are taking notes, I'm taking notes as well, but I think there's been also some landlord survey and work that has been done at CMHC. I have it on top of mind. I don't know if you folks also remember. I think it was a couple of years ago, but thank you so much for that.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Grimard. I'm a social work professor at Université de Montréal. And I have a few questions that is bridging both presentations, all of the presentations. So in the second portrait, qualitative portrait relating to the census that was done a few years ago in Quebec, the main reasons for the eviction of the people that were identified as homeless that night was regarding financial issues, credit, having really bad credit, also relationship issues. So some of them were kicked out by their partners. And I'm going to say this with, not in a good way, but I'm missing words in English, behavior issues, kind of like tagged as behavior issues. So you provided a word that has enlightened me, the missing middle. So if we're missing transitional housing projects or housing dispositif d'intervention, like there's not enough in the middle housing, and we're not working on personal financial issues, credit, and we're not either working on behavior. Not that we have to work on behavior, but if people are tagged as not knowing how to live in insides, we're kind of stuck. We're always going to reproduce the eviction and the chaos around the non-continuous model continuum d'habiter, you know. So we're like, and I talked yesterday with a representative of the government, I'm not going to say who was saying we're not going to finance more transitional housing. What we want is housing. It's like, okay, but if people are tagged as not knowing how to live in insides properly, and the support is not given accordingly, and the financial issues of the persons are not réglés. So how do we navigate through that? We're just going to forever continue the eviction and non-habitabilité, like the people will be tagged as not being able to live in insides properly.
Is that a question? Because I feel like
I think you're exactly right, and I think the point is that the de facto policy choice here is just to say, well, we're going to have a lot of folks who are homeless, right? Like that's what the decision that's being made boils down to. I think you're 100% right.
I think maybe tagging it back to research. I don't know. You can say, but there's maybe perhaps opportunity to, mental health and tenure, right? Because maybe there's this understanding of we won't take people out of the streets and under a roof, but then where are we getting at the person in their journey with mental health, right? Because living and so I'm just also thinking with you as well, because the moving in between encampments and for one type of housing to another. So thank you so much. Go Université de Montréal, my alma mater. Yes, I think
we have
go
2
ahead,
minutes
please.
left.
Oh, okay. I thought we had more time. Please.
So I have so many questions, but I'll try to be very quick to ask one. So I was really interested to hear about your research into evictions, and I understand that it's very incomplete with the data. One thing that I've been really interested in is no one seems to be talking about the impact of COVID. One of the things that happened during COVID was there would be a period of eviction freezes in many communities, and then all of a sudden on a particular date you're now allowed to evict people. And I'm wondering if anyone has looked at that research or is planning on looking at like on that magical date, what happened, or or the impacts. That I think would be a really fascinating research topic.
Yes.
Yeah, so we did 2 studies that looked at this, and specifically we looked at eviction filings in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal as well. The Montreal sample was a bit different because it wasn't specifically focused on COVID and moratoriums, but the Toronto and Vancouver studies were, and these are on the Balance of Life Housing website. And so with the Toronto study, for example, we looked at, I think it was, Sean Grisdale was the PhD student that worked on the study, looked at 380 5,000 eviction filings from 2010 to 2022. During that period, we mapped the eviction moratoriums, and the same pattern was sort of seen in Vancouver, where the moratoriums paused evictions, but we still see eviction filings happening during those moratoriums. And actually, what often happened with emergency measures that were put in place is they said, okay, you're not allowed to physically ask for an order to evict this person from their unit for, it can't be enforced by, say, the sheriff's office, but the residential tenancy board can still make a decision, and when that moratorium is lifted, you can move forward with your eviction or not. And so we see that arbitrators make the same decisions that they made outside of the moratoriums because they're working within the same rules, right? Residential tenancy acts during moratoriums didn't change in any way. And so arbitrators didn't have new tools to make the decision in any different way. They just said, this is delayed, you can't actually act on this eviction order. And so that's the trend we see, and actually, this is where our data is limited, is where we have the filing and we have the decision made on the filing that shows that decisions were largely the same, even though there were fewer decisions, right? Because there was fewer people evicting for eviction filings during that time because they knew that these moratoriums were in place. But the same decisions, the same amount, so for example, in Vancouver, we see about I think it's 70 or 80% of decisions are in favor of the landlord evicting the tenant. During the eviction moratorium, that was still the number of cases. We see a decrease in sort of for cause evictions. So evictions for cause, a lot of the time our residential tenancy board would be like, okay, no, we're not going to move, this shouldn't lead to an eviction. If it was for cause for whatever reason, but then as soon as that moratorium disappeared, we see that trend disappear and reverse in some cases. Yeah.
I'm wondering if anyone has connected that to a resulting rise in homelessness.
Yeah.
Oh,
So we have a couple of data sources that can speak to this. One is the National Shelter Study. We now have we can look at inflow over time, so people that are new to the system. So we can't connect it directly to evictions, but we do see during the pandemic, the 2020 year, the number of people new to the system dropped significantly, and that was probably a number of factors, but eviction moratorium may have contributed to that to some degree. And COVID and CERB, yeah, CERB played a role. Yeah, CERB brought people out of housing needs, and you saw that in the core housing need data as well, right? But then we also have now, shortly, this is my chance to plug the pick count survey report is coming out next month. We had a question, was your most recent housing loss due to an eviction? So we have a sample of 35,000 people experiencing homelessness, self-reporting eviction experiences and I'll give you a teaser, it's almost 40% indicated that their most recent housing loss was due to an eviction. We have questions, when did that happen? We have other questions about what was that related to? And then we have demographic questions. So there's going to be a lot of data on people experiencing visible homelessness and hidden homelessness from that report. So we'll have a high-level report coming out next month, and then we'll dig in more deeply on the eviction question in particular.
Well, thank you, David. Hopefully you'll be talking at a panel about that and sharing insights. I'm sorry to be the person to do this, but we have run out of time. Thank you so much to our panelists, our researchers. Thank you so much for you folks for the frontline work you're doing. Reach out, there is still work and research needed to be done on the transition and eviction leading to homelessness, and we're thankful that you participated, and come say hi and talk to you at the plenary.